Each of the family scale gardens that I've been managing as part of this Red Gardens project has a different fundamental idea at its core, which influences all of the methods and techniques that are used in that garden. In the extensive garden, this core idea or aim is split between developing a more resilient garden on one hand and producing vegetables of the highest nutritional quality on the other. This split, or perhaps more accurately, two sides of the same coin, comes from two different books by Steve Solomon, which I've been following in managing this garden, though I've adapted the methods over the years to suit my context and climate. This garden is different from the other gardens as there is a lot more space between the plants, and I generally try to sow the seeds directly into the soil and avoid transplanting. There is also a different focus on how to amend and feed the soil, and how to feed the plants. In a way, there is a type of holding back with this approach to managing a vegetable garden, of growing less but doing it more carefully. And although I'm still sorting out some of the issues, this garden may in fact produce better vegetables. The most obvious or visible difference with this garden compared to the other gardens is that the plants are spaced further apart, and this feels counterintuitive to me as I always want to grow more in each of the gardens. This garden would typically have half as many plants in the same area as there would be in the intensive garden or in the polytunnel garden, and fewer plants than in all of the other gardens. The main reason for giving each plant more space is to reduce the possibility of stress, to reduce the chance that the plants won't have enough soil moisture, nutrients, or space to grow into. In hot, dry spells during the growing season, plants apparently pull a lot more water out of the soil than is evaporated from the surface, especially when some form of mulch is used. In the case of this garden, regular hoeing of the weeds and a loosening of the surface of the soil between the widely spaced plants helps to create a dust mulch, which does a good job at reducing the amount of water that can evaporate from the soil. Water stress is generally much less of an issue in Ireland than it is in many other places. But we still get problematic dry spells, and with fewer plants, there is more moisture in the soil for each of them. In addition, each plant has a larger volume of soil for their roots to forage in, so there would be less competition for fertility that is available in the soil. If I was really good at providing everything that the plants needed throughout the entire growing season, then this would be less of an issue. But this strategy of spacing plants farther apart adds a layer of resilience just in case I'm not as good of a grower as I should be. While the other gardens focus on soil biology or in developing loose, friable soil with a lot of organic matter, this garden focuses on the volume of soil that is available for the roots of each plant and helping the plants develop strong root systems. This is done by directly sowing the seeds into the soil whenever possible and avoiding sowing into modules or pots for transplanting. The theory is that the direct sowing will prevent the inevitable damage or winding up of the plant roots and the shock or disruption that the plants can experience when transplanted. Allowing the plants to grow undisturbed in one place also creates larger, more vigorous root systems that can spread out throughout the soil, compared to the more compact root balls that often develop with transplanted plants. But direct sowing does have its issues, including seeds failing to germinate, increased risk of slug damage, slower growth, and trying to get the most out of frost-tender crops in the cool maritime growing season that we have here in Ireland. A good example of this is last year's crop of runner beans that I sowed in pots in the beginning of May for transplanting into the other gardens, but I waited an additional 3 weeks before direct sowing the seeds into this extensive garden. I wanted to make sure that the soil and weather had warmed up enough and the risk of frost had reduced. But this delay led to a comparable delay in the plants starting to produce beans and resulted in a significantly lower yield from this garden. The weather cooled down again and the autumn arrived before these plants had the chance to reach their full productivity, but the plants in the other gardens had had a 3-week head start and did much better and produced a lot more. This season I'm going to sow the runner bean seeds earlier in this garden, but provide protection with a temporary mini polytunnel, and it will be interesting to see if these plants do any better. All of the other issues with direct sowing can be managed in various ways, but it all takes extra effort, but so does looking after seedlings in pots or modules, hardening them off and transplanting them. I still occasionally transplant seedlings into this garden, but I'm learning how to avoid this without making too much work for myself or risk not having a crop. Another key issue with focusing on direct sowing whenever possible is it reduces the opportunities for successional cropping, of growing an additional crop either before or after another one. I used to try to get a fast-growing spring crop in before the summer crops, but I often struggled with the timing and overlap of this, especially with unpredictable weather. So I don't plan for that anymore, or for this garden at least, and accept that I'm only going to get certain types of crops, but it makes the task of managing the garden easier and with less pressure. The layout of the garden with everything in long rows also makes things easier in planting and sowing, but more importantly with weeding, as it's quick and easy to weed down between the rows. The long rows of plants do cause an issue when trying to sow a later crop right beside a more established crop, as they can really suffer from the competition. This is less of an issue with some of the other gardens that have more of a block planting strategy rather than in rows. A bit of careful planning can help work around this, but lately I've not been trying to squeeze in the other crops and waiting for a whole section to clear before re-sowing, typically the following season. This means that this garden tends to be more focused on main crops rather than the faster crops, and it also means that more of the soil is empty and exposed for more of the season. This is a bit counterintuitive as it feels like a waste of space, but I know that the soil underneath is full of the roots of the nearby plants, which will typically end up being bigger and stronger with all of the extra room. The other key difference with this extensive garden is that it makes use of less compost than any of the other gardens I manage, making do with only about 12 wheelbarrow loads of compost each season for the whole 100 square meter garden, whereas I tend to use 2 to 3 times that amount on the other gardens. This smaller amount of compost is what I can fairly easily make in a season, but the larger amounts needed for the other gardens can be too much for many people to produce themselves, requiring additional compost to be imported in from elsewhere. In the case of the extensive garden, rather than importing bulk compost or organic material, I buy in different types of concentrated fertility and amendments to remineralize the soil based on detailed soil tests from a lab and to feed the plants. These imports include chicken manure pellets for nitrogen and a range of other nutrients, rock powders high in phosphorus and potassium, seaweed dust for a wide range of trace elements, and small amounts of sea salt, sulfur, and concentrated forms of zinc, boron, and copper. Essentially, the moderate amounts of compost that I add is to introduce organic matter into the soil to feed the soil biology, and I'm not relying on that compost to supply significant amounts of nutrients to the plants. The concentrated amendments that I add are used to improve the balance of the nutrients that would be available to the soil ecosystem and the plants, and to top up on the supply of these nutrients to make up for what has likely been extracted by the plants. In summary, I actively manage the fertility and balance of nutrients in this garden by adding materials that I import in, and I use a lot less compost. I intentionally grow plants much wider apart than in the other gardens, and I tend not to put in the effort to try to fit in additional crops before, after, or beside the crops that I do grow. I also try to direct sow where possible, sowing everything in long rows for ease of management, and to accept that more of the soil is going to be bare for part of the season. This set of strategies is quite different from the methods used in the other gardens, and it is interesting to explore alternate ways of managing a garden. The overall yield is lower than in the other gardens, which is to be expected, with fewer plants and fewer crops, and there are definitely things I can do to improve this. There is significantly less work involved in this garden, especially in managing and preparing compost and managing seedlings, but a little more effort in protecting the direct sown plants would likely increase yields quite a bit. This overall garden seems easier to manage to me, now that I've got my head around issues of soil testing and calculating for amendments. And I expect that the soil fertility will improve again this year, which should also improve the yields. This garden also seems more resilient to me, so long as I can continue to get all the amendments that are required. But resilience is one of the core aims of the advice that Steve Solomon gives in his books. Perhaps most importantly, the vegetables in this garden tend to be good quality and have tasted better than the vegetables from the other gardens. Over the last few years, I have occasionally had groups of people taste the same crops from all of the gardens, including beetroot, cauliflower, and carrots, and the samples from the extensive garden were generally considered to be better tasting with a more full flavor. This is a really good indication to me that things are going in the right direction with this garden, and it will be really interesting to see if things continue to develop this season and into the future, and if focusing on growing less will continue to produce better quality vegetables.